everybody is just rushing forward headlessly. Where are the NCOs? Where are the officers guiding them, controlling the units, doing their best to keep people together? I'm Alexander Watson.
I'm Gary Edelman.
My name is Bill Allison.
I'm Dr. John Curatola.
Hi, I'm Matt Ziemann.
Today we'll be looking at some Vietnam War movies.
American Civil War battles.
Battle scenes in First World War movies.
World War II dogfight scenes.
World War II battle scenes in the movies and determine how real they actually are. And what we're seeing here is the amphibious assault of the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. Many of those men who came off those landing craft had to traverse up to 100 to 200 yards while under enemy fire before they would even reach the shingle, which is the main slope of the beach itself. And the movie doesn't really depict that. They basically get off the landing craft and they're already on the beach or on the shingle. The machine gun, the MG-42, that the Germans are using. This is a high-velocity, high-caliber weapon. Problem is, they're using it in very long bursts. A weapon like that can only really be effectively used in 2 to 3 second bursts. Otherwise, the barrel will burn out, and then you have a problem with the weapon itself. And if you hear the rates of fire in the movie, they're pretty long.
Store party! No armor has made it ashore. We got no DD tanks on the beach.
Tom Hanks' character is on the radio talking to the commander of the amphibious task force, a lowly Army captain talking to an admiral that is way beyond his pay grade. A company commander is not calling the commander of the amphibious task force from a field radio just to report his position. But it does show an excellent portrayal of the confusion. In the clip, it doesn't really show how the U.S. forces got on top of the high ground off of the shingle and the beach. And that's okay, because depending on where you landed on D-Day, whether you were at Utah or Omaha Beach, the topography was very different. Some units had relatively shallow heights that they had to scale. Some had cliff faces, like the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had to literally go up a cliff face to get to the German positions. While it does have a few technical errors, is very accurate of the assault on Normandy Beach, and I give it an 8 out of 10. The Germans are well defended within the town itself, and the Americans have to assault it. The unit move into the town of Curatola into what we call a mount environment, military operations in urban terrain, which is very difficult. The danger with an urban environment is that the enemy can hide anywhere and everywhere.
Dog and Fox are pulling back. What?
You have German armor that is coming down upon their defensive positions. They're showing that the other companies, DNF, are breaking and running. Only one company ran, the other one stayed there for a long time, and that company kind of took some umbrage with this depiction of them and running, and that's not accurate. The bazooka you see used is accurate in the fact that they were down at the tactical level. Most companies had them. And so they were distributed widely while they were engaged. Armor is soft-skinned on its belly. When its belly is exposed, you can indeed pierce it.
Well, hello, second armor.
It isn't the 2nd Armored Division that saves the company in this particular scene. What happens is Dick Winters, who serves as the company commander, calls in mortar support. And it's the mortars that help drive off the German armor. In most tables of organization, infantry companies and infantry battalions have mortars attached to them within a weapons company or some other attachments to provide that additional firepower for infantry forces that are relatively lightly armed. 2nd Armored Division does relieve Easy Company later on in the day, but it isn't like 2nd Armor showed up in the nick of time to save Easy Company's bacon. This is a very accurate portrayal, and I would give this a 9 out of 10 easily. In this scene, we're seeing the British forces as they evacuate the continent of Europe at Dunkirk. You see the men lined up in queues in order to get on the ships. And that's true. In many of the pictures of Dunkirk, see the soldiers indeed doing that. They would get in their lines and they would break apart if there was an air attack, and then they would get back in their queues. One thing I didn't understand is why guys would stand in the water all day when there's no boat there. This is a very good depiction of what air combat was like during this part of the war. You have to lead the enemy target. And the German basically flies into the bullets, and that's really how it's supposed to work. And one of the things you'll notice, he has to do it in short 2-3 second bursts because they only have so much ammunition in their wings. They have to be very conservative about the rounds that they do fire because you only have maybe 10 seconds.
Yeah, he's down for the count.
The British fighter is jumped by the second German fighter. That's accurate. This is the days before radar. There's nothing to hear. It's too noisy, it's too loud. And so as a result, a lot of aerial kills in both wars really result from surprise. What's problematic with that scene is Germans don't operate solo. Usually they're going to operate in 2 or 4-man ships working together. Here you see one Me-109 and then followed by another Me-109. And they really don't work that way. Because this is 80 years after the war, those really aren't Me-109s. Those are actually Hispania 1112 Bunchans, which are basically Messerschmitt airframes with Merlin engines installed in them. But we use them a lot on air shows today to represent an Me-109, since there are very few of them actually in existence today. Overall, I give this movie a 7 out of 10. What we're seeing here in the movie Enemy at the Gates is a Russian assault on a German position in the Battle of Stalingrad. And so this idea that they would send troops forward without a weapon and with limited rounds is a little absurd. The Russians had plenty of guns, weapons, in terms of small arms. Basically a human wave tactic, just throw men into the mix and see what happens. And that certainly does occur in places in history. However, this idea of just throwing men nilly-willy into a cauldron is certainly a waste of manpower, and it's not something that they did in large scale. The way the Russians actually win this fight is they provide a pincher movement on the north and the southern edges of the city of Stalingrad, and they cut off the German 6th Army. Another problem with this particular scene is once the Soviet assault fails, they're running backwards and then their own forces fire on them to prevent them from coming back into their friendly lines. They didn't do that either. Did they certainly shoot individuals for desertion and cowardice? Sure, absolutely, but not in the manner that they're depicting here. They had blocking battalions that would be used to keep formations intact and to keep them beefed up on the front lines, but not in the manner that's depicted here. Certainly you have to pull back, reconsolidate, reassault. That's just the reality of warfare. So I'd give this a 3 out of 10. What we see in this movie, Defiance, is the Bielski brothers are Jewish partisans who basically defy Nazi occupation of the Belarus area where they live. They use light arms because they can move in and out relatively quickly. The Germans will use a lot of vehicles to get their troops from point A to point B. And there's many accounts of the Jews who are in hiding here attacking those kinds of convoys, but not against armor. And there's a lot of problems with this particular scene. When they're firing the main gun, I'm not quite sure who they're shooting at because you don't use a main gun to shoot people. Can you shoot people with it? Absolutely. But it isn't the kind of thing that is the most effective use of that weapon system. I think it's supposed to be a Panzer Mark IV, not even close to looking like a Panzer Mark IV. The other problem with the fact that there's a tank there is by 1943 and 1944, the Germans need all the armor they can get. And using it in a rare action capacity like this, it's a problem. That armor asset would probably be used on the front lines fighting the Russians. Regarding the gentleman in the cupola of the turret, there are 2 schools of thought on this, actually. There are those that believe that the tank commander who would sit in the cupola should be up and out so he can see things better. However, for the Soviet Union, they thought very differently. They wanted to go into battle buttoned up and protected. So it's a matter on how you see the tank commander's role. Is he somebody who should be just commanding the crew and the utilization of that armor piece, or should be up and out looking around the battlefield and scanning it for potential targets, for coordination? Is that an accurate depiction? Yeah, probably, depending on the commander himself and what risk he can assess. Given the fact that the partisans are lightly armed with just rifles, a couple of pistols, and maybe some hand grenades, there's not much they can really do to this tank. If they were to button up, they could easily drive off unless there was some kind of obstacle. And that's one thing the brothers did do. They did fall trees to block roads. We don't see that in this particular scene. I'd probably give this a 4.
All right, let's get the boys off. Get them off. Give me last man. Watch your space.
There's a couple of problems here with this scene. First of all, tanks don't operate independently. They're not out there on their own. They're usually part of a regimental combat team or some other larger organization. Again, this idea of combined arms. Infantry with armor, with artillery, and maybe with some air power. And so in this movie, you see these tanks operating almost as independent elements. And armor doesn't work that way. You see the infantry following closely behind the armor. That was a tactic, technique, and procedure used early on to follow the armor. But the problem with that is you can't talk to each other because the tanks are loud, and you can't talk to the tank commander. There's some tactical problems here with this particular scene. The Germans set up a linear ambush, but there's no L shape to this ambush. An L-shaped ambush is intended to stop the enemy advancement and then attack them from the flanks. Here the Germans are just in a parallel formation to the Americans as they're trolling along.
Let's go. Let's clean it up.
One tank next to the other tank, next to the other tank. That's not how they would do it. They would immediately get into some kind of a combat spread, one providing a base of fire with 1 or 2 other tanks moving as a maneuver element to kind of flank the enemy to provide additional support. And if this is a prepared ambush, and it looks like it is because the Germans have dug in, you wouldn't see them in a linear formation because, again, it's too easy to pick off those tanks as they're sitting there in a nice, neat formation. It looks great for parades. It doesn't work in combat. It looks like a laser. It's not. The flashes of light you see are tracers. Usually, soldiers will use those to help mark where their rounds are going because rounds are basically invisible when they're in flight. It's not out of the ordinary to see that many tracers going down range. It does show the grittiness of war. It does show how dirty it was, the cramped quarters within a tank itself. But again, the tactics that both the Americans and the Germans are using here kind of fall short. I give this a 6. So when you look at this depiction of the Battle of El Ghautar, it really is lacking. First of all, you got guys with weapons slung over their shoulders. They're not even in any kind of a tactical formation. They're just kind of walking around. And the German army's better than that. Even at this stage of the war, the Germans are still a highly disciplined, mobile force. One of the things you see in this movie is the use of artillery. These puffs of smoke that you see in the battle itself, rounds generally just don't blow up in the air like that. Can it happen? Yeah, but not to the degree you see in these movies. There's a lot of air power that occurs during the Battle of El Ghautar from both the German and the American perspective. That's largely absent in this particular movie. I would give this a 3 out of 10. What we're seeing here is a depiction of the Battle of Scheldt in September of 1944. And it's a fairly accurate engagement. One, because it's so muddy. Many of these fields are already flooded by bombing from Allied bombers who are destroying some of the dikes. And the Germans do some flooding on their own to make it an obstacle for offensive operations. And so what that leaves is only a few avenues of approach that the Canadian and British forces can actually cover to get to these objectives. And this is one of the hardest fights during the Western European campaign. I think they lose up to 13,000 casualties in the short span of a month. The Germans have put their defensive positions on these few avenues of approach, and so the British Army, the Commonwealth forces, have to go up these particular avenues of approach in order to rid the Germans of their location. So it's pretty accurate that it's a very narrow frontage. You also see the use of British artillery, keeping in mind too that because the fields are so flooded, the use of armor doesn't really help the British forces out at all. And so this really becomes an infantryman's slog with some artillery support, and there's some aviation support. It's not seen in this movie, but in the actual battle, the aviation really does help in this combined arms integration. What you see here too is a German artillery piece. It's an 88 millimeter anti-tank gun. It is a legendary piece of artillery that the Germans initially designed it for anti-aircraft, but then they found that it's a great anti-tank weapon, and if you lower it, and you see it in that example as it's traversed down, being fired parallel to the deck as opposed to vertically in the sky. And the Germans did that to great effect. I give this a 9 out of 10.
Hi, I'm Matt Ziemann. I'm an instructor with the Air Force's Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base. I've been a pilot for 26 years. We actually did get a couple airplanes airborne, and I mean, those are all amazing stories. The guys that are loosely depicted in this scene, Welch and Taylor, they were out partying the night before, all-night poker game, and they had just gone to bed like about an hour beforehand. They heard the bombs going off. They were still wearing tuxedo pants. They jumped in a car going about 100 miles an hour, getting shot at along the way. True story. So if you got a plane chasing another one in level flight, those bullets are going to be shooting out way ahead. They're not going to be splashing down in the water right in front of it. Competition aerobatic planes and, modern fighters can kind of do a knife edge pass like that, but, a P-40 couldn't do that. If you're on its side flying through basically a canyon of buildings like that, you're going to end up flying into the buildings. The Japanese did fly extremely low, so I guess there's some realism there. There were multiple accounts of guys seeing planes that were either scraping the belly fuel tank or, scraping the tips of their propellers. Welch and Taylor and the other guys that actually did get in dogfights were up at higher altitudes, not flying at treetop level.
Danny, I still got 3 on my tank. Come on, now!
So mid-airs do happen in air combat when you got a lot of planes flying around the sky, but to have that kind of coordination, do a head-on pass and cut right at the last second so that the Zeros would fly into each other is quite a bit of fiction. Yeah, so that's one thing that I think Hollywood pretty often gets wrong in showing just this unlimited firepower. It's limited to begin with, which is why you fire short bursts. You don't waste your ammunition. Welch and Taylor didn't even have a full load of their guns when they got airborne. He looks like a kid in an arcade game with both hands on the stick, going left and right. You don't do that. Your left hand's on the throttle. The only time you really use both hands on the stick is, if you're pulling back in kind of a brake turn. I give it about a 4.
Enemy fighters, 11 o'clock! We got company!
Using a hand microphone like that, if you're not wearing an oxygen mask that has a microphone in it, guys would wear throat mics that it would kind of pick up the vibrations in your vocal cords. And if you think about it, you fly an airplane with your right hand, you're definitely not going to have time in the middle of combat to pick up a microphone and talk into it and put it back and then take control of the airplane. That's completely unrealistic. We'd call that a snapshot. It's just kind of a quick target of opportunity as bad guys pass in front of you. The SBD Dauntless, it's a scout dive bomber, but actually did pretty good air to air. It had about a 3-to-1 kill ratio, so it actually shot down 3 enemy airplanes for every Dauntless that got shot down by an enemy airplane. So there's 2 kinds of enemy fire against aircraft. There's barrage fire, which are flak, which are shells that explode at kind of a predetermined altitude. And then there's kind of the aimed fire, typical machine gun. The flak is those black bursts that are happening, and those bursts are following all the way down the dive. That's not terribly realistic. That would be kind of blanketing a certain altitude. And then you would have the machine gun fire that would be, tracking the guy through the dive. He's releasing later than they really would. So you'd roll into that near vertical dive and typically release the bomb at about 2,000 feet to recover around 500 feet. The reason they do dive bombing is because if you're in a level dive and you drop a bomb, there's a lot of error that can happen. The steeper your dive is, the more you're basically just dropping straight down. It minimizes a lot of those errors. Because they're in that vertical dive, you don't want that bomb to be going right through your propeller arc and hit your blade. So they had a little trapeze. When you would release the bomb, it would swing the bomb outside of the diameter of the propeller arc to be clear of the aircraft. And he does a decent job of kind of showing the G-forces as you pull out from a dive. You're pulling pretty aggressively there. Trying to, hide in the clouds, that is a fairly valid tactic. You can't really see in the cloud, so disappear into the cloud, maybe fly around a little bit, pop out a different side and hope that the bad guy doesn't find you. And same for the Zero to just be right at that point in time as he comes out of the cloud, to be right in a shooting position. A little unrealistic. The idea to, kind of haul back with both hands is pretty accurate. Some guys would even black out, call it G-lock, G-induced loss of conscious. But the idea was, hey, if I'm still holding back on the stick, the nose is going up. So I'm at least, flying away from the ground. And, even if I pass out or release the stick, the blood flow will start coming back and I'll wake up. But yeah, that defies the laws of physics, to release at, about 200 feet there and recover just skimming the deck of the carrier. That guy out in the water, that's Ensign George Gay. He was the only guy to survive from his squadron. The entire squadron got shot down, but he watched the entire Battle of Midway bobbing in the water there and was eventually rescued, but quite a witness to history. So he's jinking there, which are, doing kind of rapid changes in direction so the gunners can't track you. Easiest way to get killed is just fly in a straight line and be a predictable target. But you would not fly straight at an enemy ship like that and fly right at the guns. I'd give this about a 3.5. Very accurate. The Brits operated in what they call a 3-ship Vic, at least early in the war. And the idea was the two guys on the wings just follow the leader, and he focuses on the target. Once they engage, then everybody can start firing. For this time period, that's extremely accurate. If anything, they might be a little bit wider so they're not just close formation the whole time.
Check fuel, Fortis 1 and 2.
Very accurate for lead to ask for a fuel check. The wingmen burn more gas than lead does, so lead's making sure that they've got enough gas. And the Spitfire didn't hold a lot, just a little bit over an hour of flight time. So to take off from an airfield in southeast England and get over to the French coast, you didn't have a whole lot of playtime before you'd have to come back. So very accurate consideration there.
Keep them peeled, they'll come out of the sun.
That's still a valid tactic today where, try to get the sun behind you because it's really difficult to see. From World War I until now, that is still, a dominant tactic to try and, come out of the sun. The only downside out of this one is you're not terribly effective patrolling down at, wave top level below 500 feet. Normally these guys are going to be up quite a bit higher, 10,000 feet, maybe even higher. Spitfire doesn't carry a whole lot of ammo. You're pretty limited, so you want to do short bursts of about 2 seconds or so. So he's doing a good job there. He's missing the target, though, because he's not leading it. To hit a point in space, you've got to shoot out ahead of it so that, the bullets and the target meet at the same point in time.
Clip.
Bad guys don't always just explode into a ball of flames, and it's pretty common, if you damage the engine or the flight controls, it'll just kind of be a gradual descent as opposed to, the airplane just exploding or a wing coming off. So cool shot. A little unrealistic, our fearless Spitfire pilot has run out of gas, which is not inaccurate for the amount of fuel the Spitfire carried and, if you're engaged in combat over the coast. Planes do glide. Once the engine is out, Spitfire can go about 2 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude. And I'd say he's at about 1,000 feet, so he can maybe go 2 miles. So at that altitude, he's got probably less than a minute. That's a Stuka dive bomber, and the Stuka actually had sirens installed on them. They were air powered. That makes that very distinctive sound, and they use that for psychological purposes. But it's funny how any movie will show just about any kind of airplane that's in a dive will be making that screaming sound. To turn around and engage a fighter, you're bleeding energy. Any turns that you make, and you're going down quicker. So the ability to turn back, shoot a guy, and then turn back down the beach, it's a little bit of a stretch. I mean, the guns work regardless. So theoretically, yes, it is possible to shoot a guy down, with the engine off. Famous fighter pilot Robin Olds got a kill in World War II. He forgot to switch fuel tanks, and right when he was lined up on a bad guy, and so the engine quit, but he was in a shooting position. He took the shot. He shot down the bad guy, and then switched his fuel tanks and was back in business. You'd want to torch the plane so it doesn't fall in enemy hands. The Spitfire was, Britain's most advanced fighter at the time, and you never want to let that technology fall into enemy hands so they can, either reverse engineer it or figure out how to negate the Spitfire's advantages. So definitely that was pretty realistic to torch the plane. We still do that these days. It just looks like the propeller's on a stick mounted to the rest of the plane. It ignores this entire, V12 metal engine block that would be filling up that space. So you were so close. Yeah, I'd say overall, I'd probably give Dunkirk about a 7.5. There's a lot that's really good. Love the fact that they use real airplanes.
Here we go, Lightning.
Red Tails talks about the Tuskegee Airmen. It was an all African-American fighter group. Amazing story. They trained right here in Alabama, and due to segregation at the time, they had to fight really two battles. There was the battle against the Germans, and there was the battle against segregation and racism. So the fact that the guy's flying straight and level, he knows there's fighters out there, and he's just, kind of looking side to side, but not really doing anything. You're just a sitting duck. The easiest way to be a target is flying a straight line. So if you know there's bad guys out there and you know there's shooting going on, the first thing you're going to do is at least just change direction so you're not a predictable target.
9 o'clock low! 9 o'clock low!
Planes don't do kind of little hockey stops like that, rolling in behind somebody.
These jets ain't nothing.
The Mustangs are keeping up with the jets, which is completely unrealistic.
More speed! Let's get some altitude.
Gaining altitude to be able to get more of a energy differential was pretty common, but you wouldn't do it just by doing a loop right there. You're trading in that kinetic energy for that potential energy. So ideally, if you see the enemy from a distance, you're able to maneuver and start kind of a gentle climb so you get up above them. I'd give Red Tails a 3. The only redeeming value is telling the story of the Red Tails, which is an important story to tell.
Bombardier to pilot, your ship.
Roger.
So the Bombardier is actually flying the airplane on the bomb run. When he's got control with the gun sight, the corrections, the gun sight's basically flying the plane on autopilot, and so no matter what the Bombardier's doing, that will actually steer the aircraft, and the Bombardier's got control on the bomb run.
Uh-oh. 0 inbound, 10 o'clock level.
When he called 0, 10 o'clock, that was accurate clock position. Sometimes in movies they'll call a clock position, like enemy fighters 3 o'clock, and they're looking to the left side, but 3 o'clock is off to your right. So head-on attacks were not uncommon. They would actually fly kind of in a wall, inverted, to get as close to the bomber as possible, and then use gravity to your advantage, so you could pull back on the stick and you just dive away. And the Japanese did that as well because they knew that the front side of the bomber was the least defended. So there you see kind of the catastrophic hit. Sometimes it's just a matter of hitting a fuel tank on the wing or hitting the engine, or maybe even just killing the pilot, where you don't necessarily get that pretty big fireball. So overall, this is a pretty accurate clip. I'd say they do a pretty good job with this. I'd probably give it a 9. You see the brass shell casings coming out of the wings. That's pretty realistic. A lot of people don't think, and they just think about the bullet coming out of the barrel, but not all the brass that's getting expelled. Ramming the plane, that did happen. If you have a midair collision at those speeds, that force, it's just gonna be a cloud of pieces and parts. In that clip, the 0, looks relatively unscathed. That's complete fiction. If you cut off the tail of the plane's not going to spin out of control. It's just basically going to fall straight down because the tail gives it its stability in pitch. A few too many airplanes for a Navy fighter squadron at that time, but what they're doing, they're dropping their external fuel tanks. So to try and maximize range, you would carry external fuel tanks that you would jettison once you made contact with the enemy, because they gave you extra gas, but they're going to slow you down. They're extra drag and extra weight. Pretty unrealistic attack run. It's not a dive bomber. You know, typically the kamikazes were coming in at, you know, a lower angle. For him to pitch up like that, call it a pop-up attack, at the top of the apex, you know, when you pitch over and dive back down, you're pretty slow right there at the peak when you're pitching over, and extremely vulnerable because you're going so slow. Usually for the kamikaze guys, they're going to come in low and they're going to stay fairly low. Or they're going to start off higher and just have all the extra energy to do that dive to begin with, but not do a kind of a pop-up and diving attack. They've got, you know, a couple very small attention to detail of the brass shell casings coming out, but everything else just pretty terrible. I give it about a 1.5. St. Paul's Cathedral there and Battle of Britain, you know, those high-altitude dogfights were leaving contrails that were just swirling masses over the skies that were visible by people of London and the English countryside. It was kind of unique in warfare to watch these dogfights going on overhead. You know, if take a hit in the engine, oil starts spewing out, covering the windscreen. That's pretty real. You don't have windshield wipers, so you're just kind of stuck with a black screen in front of you. That's a really good job showing what it's like bailing out of a World War II fighter. You know, you slide the canopy back, unhitch your harness. That guy's got a line twist. You can't plan for that. But that was a minor malfunction, and he's kind of bicycle kicking his legs to try and get a kind of a gyroscopic effect to unwind the parachute riser. So that's extremely realistic. One of the greatest things about this movie was how many airplanes they used. The fact that they used real airplanes, it was one of the greatest parts about this movie. They joked that they were one of the world's largest air forces when they did this. This is one of the best ones out there. I give this a solid 9.
Go get him, little friends!
That's accurate. The bomber guys called the fighters little friends. Although the fact that they have P-51s weren't in combat at this point in 1943. They came along a lot later. The Americans operated in a 4-ship formation. You still got that mutual support. You'd be in a flight of 4 aircraft with 2 elements or 2 sections, each one with a lead and a supporting wingman. So that's pretty accurate. So this we would call a high aspect merge, where you go head to head and merge with the enemy. A head-on shot like that, again, is a really difficult shot. Those fighters are very small, and to try to hit those targets at those closing speeds are pretty difficult. But when they show them merge and the Mustangs kind of go up and engage them, that's pretty good. And they're in a loose enough formation that they can, the wingmen are able to keep sight of lead, but also engage the enemy themselves, as opposed to just flying tight formation. Fighters aren't really flying that close. You have to do that just for, cinematography purposes to get both aircraft in the frame.
Tail gunner, what's wrong?
I'm running out of ammo, Cap.
I'll take care of it.
And this is where it departs from reality. There is no way that the co-pilot would leave his seat, in combat and go take the place of a tail gunner.
I got him. I got him!
But the fact that you can't control when a plane, goes out of control, that it might, fly into another aircraft or a bomber like that, stuff like that did happen. So again, when you have that many airplanes in that relatively small piece of sky, stuff happens. I'd probably give it about a 7.5.
I'm Alexander Watson. I'm Professor of History at Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm an expert on the First World War. I've written 3 books. We don't think of watches as weapons of war, but they really, really were in the First World War. If you were going to have a successful attack by 1917, everything had to be synchronized. The first wave needed to go over together, followed then afterwards by the second wave, but above all, you needed to synchronize with the artillery behind you. That's something that a lot of filmmakers forget, that infantry didn't simply act on their own. They acted in combined arms with an artillery bombardment. So getting that timing right was really, really crucial. And we see that with the officer looking at his watch. That's a great start to the scene.
You can't possibly make it that way, man. You bloody insane.
There is some historical context to this scene. The Battle of the Somme, huge battle, 500,000 casualties on both sides, took place in the second half of 1916, and the Germans really suffered badly. And they decided to withdraw their lines back to stronger positions in early 1917. And the backstory here is that the British Army is pursuing them. This is a temporary trench, so that's why there aren't any sandbags. It's simply been dug to protect the assaulting troops. This meant to take place on the Somme, or just beyond the Somme battlefield. And the ground there was really chalky. It was known to be white and chalky, and they've really represented that well in the film.
No, 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 no.
I never understand why he goes over the parapet. In a First World War trench, you've got kind of two mounds of earth, one behind it and one in front of it. The one in front of it is called the parapet. That's the one that soldiers will shoot over it. The other one is called the parados. And that was actually built slightly higher than the parapet. And the reason for that was that if a soldier put his head up over the parapet, and if there wasn't any earth behind him, then you'd have the horizon, he'd be easily seen. Now, there's going to be an attack, and all of these troops are going to go over the parapet. Why doesn't he just climb over the parados? There's nobody there. He could simply run unimpeded without any problems. He'd even get some cover from the guys going over the parapet. If you send your men forward without any artillery support, everybody is going to die. They didn't send men over like this. The guidelines that the army releases in early 1917 is that when you advance, you need to advance with the artillery. And you have what's called a creeping barrage. And what a creeping barrage was a line of shells which would pummel the ground in front of the infantry and move forward at set times. And they did that in order to clear no man's land of any defenders, so you need to be rid of them, and then moving into the trenches to keep the defenders' heads down, which you desperately needed to do if everyone wasn't going to be machine gunned to death. So by this point, April 1917, you're going to only go forward with a creeping barrage generally. You're not going to do it any other way, and that's just absent from here. Everybody is just rushing forward headlessly. If they actually get to the German lines, which they're clearly not going to do because they haven't got any artillery support, but what are they going to do once they're there? Where are the NCOs? Where are the officers guiding them, controlling the units, doing their best to keep people together? The helmets that they used were called Brody helmets, and they were above all designed to protect against shrapnel. Because if you think about the position that these soldiers are in, they're actually defended very well on either side by the trench itself. Trenches really were very effective at protecting soldiers. It's only when soldiers leave the trenches that they become extremely vulnerable. Where they are vulnerable, though, is on the top of their heads. And so that was why you had this kind of battle bowler type arrangement with hardened steel and the rim around it to protect the head above all. That was why they were designed like this. I'd give it a 4. In August 1914, cavalry plays quite an important role. We tend to think of the First World War as being entirely static, but it did start off very mobile. The Germans storm through Belgium and they occupy a large chunk of northeastern France. Some of the cavalry was equipped with swords. This was one of the things that they were trained to do. Key omission from how these British cavalrymen are presented is that none of them have rifles. And that's a big mistake because while British cavalry were trained to charge like they're portrayed doing here, they were also trained to scout, and they were also trained to act as mounted infantry. So they would dismount and they would be able to defend a position or work round to the flank of a position. So they've got multiple roles, and that was actually what made them so useful. So this idea that the film is going to hammer into our heads that cavalry are obsolete at this point, it's actually not true. All right, so this is the point that everything gets ridiculous. But what they have done is they've taken their machine guns and they put them in a forest all aimed at their camp. And there are 6 machine guns here. 6 machine guns was the allowance for an entire German regiment in 1914. German regiment was around 3,000 men. So this is the number of machine guns that would be expected to support 3,000 men. In reality, in 1914, you had about 7 machine guns for every 2 kilometres of ground. You wouldn't have arranged 6 machine guns behind 3 trees. This is the literal definition of overkill. As a cavalryman, if you're confronted by an entire regiment's worth of machine guns, or even just one, which would be sufficient, why would you keep on charging towards it? That makes no sense. What you would do is you would veer off to the left or to the right. You would get into cover, there's plenty of forest here, and then you would use your training as mounted infantry to dismount and try and take these machine guns from the flank. Also as well, cavalry in a forest, if you charge into a forest on a horse, you're going to break the horse's legs. This is a really, really bad idea. 3 out of 10? The Germans have really made a lot of effort on their trenches. They've brought their heavy weaponry to defend the trenches, but they've forgotten to put any barbed wire down at all in no man's land. You would have had loads and loads of barbed wire on it. I mean, that's the key omission, and it's a huge omission. Of course, they've done that because they want her running towards them. By 1918, the German army wasn't simply composed of riflemen. In 1918, if the German army had been confronted by an invincible female superhero and they were shooting at her with bullets and that didn't work, then they can go to a light machine gun, an MGO 815, or they've got a Minenwerfer, a light mortar, 7.58 centimetre mortar that they can shoot at her. So full credit to Wonder Woman for that. These kind of shafts of light that are being fired are tracer bullets or incendiary bullets. And there were tracers used in the First World War, but they were mainly used for anti-aircraft work and by aircraft as well. They weren't used by frontline machine guns. They would expose your position, which you really didn't want to do because you'd bring down artillery and mortar onto you. And the second reason, it would actually be a war crime. Using incendiary bullets against enemy troops was a war crime by the standards of 1914 to 18, so it wasn't done. There's another error there. You've got a church in the background, and that would be the first thing to be knocked down by heavy artillery because it would be a great observation post. You just didn't have high towers directly behind the lines. 3 out of 10.
Come on, push forward!
One thing that I do appreciate about this scene is that you do actually have an officer attempting to lead the men and keep some sort of control and tell them where they're going and direct them. That's often forgotten. Okay, so this is all wrong. I mean, firstly, who brings a warning gong into no man's land when you're on an attack? You know, they did use warning gongs to signal that there was a gas attack, but in the trenches. Gas was used famously in the First World War. It was used from 1915. They started with chlorine. The Germans introduced phosgene, which was more lethal. It's pretty light, slightly yellowish, so it wasn't that easy to detect either. But gas was an offensive weapon, and that's because both chlorine and phosgene are heavier than air. So if you're trying to take a trench, then if you plaster it with phosgene or chlorine, that gas is going to sink down into the trench and then down into the dugouts as well. Very, very dangerous for defending troops. Against attacking troops in the open, though, you wouldn't use gas. These troops are above ground, not underneath, but the gas sinks down. And your own defending troops are, of course, below the ground in trenches and dugouts, so you're actually more likely to risk them rather than hurt the attacking troops. Phosgene, for example, it was lethal, but it took a few hours for soldiers to get really, really ill. If you're being attacked by enemy soldiers, really you want an immediate impact before they get to your trench. So as a result, you use shrapnel. This isn't a plausible scenario that we're watching. The scene is implausible, but we do get a really nice look at a British PH helmet, which was a mid-war gas mask. Unfortunately, he's wearing it wrongly. You need an an airtight seal for this to work effectively, and the way that they did that was they stuffed the bottom of the mask down their collars. And he hasn't done that, so he's going to be in trouble in a couple of hours' time. This is really a 3 because they could at least get the gas mask fitting right, you know? You can feel the power of these 1918 Saint-Germain French tanks. And on top of that, I love how they have them looming through the smoke. They were actually very vulnerable to artillery fire. And so what the French did was they would put down a smoke barrage, smoke shells, in front of the tanks to obscure them. And then they would come out toward the enemy trenches. And that's really, really well represented. So there's problems as well with how the Germans are behaving here. The trench that they're defending is actually a French trench, and these French tanks are counterattacking. And the thing about trenches is they were built to defend one way. So you'd have the fire step opposite the enemy, facing the enemy. You'd have the machine gun emplacements facing the enemy as well. But in this trench, miraculously, all of the fire steps, the defences, suddenly seem to be facing, if you like, the wrong way towards the French counterattackers. And it wouldn't have happened. In 1918, if you saw tanks coming towards you as a German soldier, the first thing you do is you get your flare gun and you shoot a flare, a signal flare, out over to alert the artillery behind you to bring down a covering bombardment. That's your best chance of survival, the best chance to hold a trench. And there's nothing of that here. By 1918, the Germans have a number of nasty tricks up their sleeves in order to fight tanks. They've got light mortars, so-called Minenwerfer, which can be turned horizontal to fire directly at a tank. They've even got specialised anti-tank weapons. They've got anti-tank rifles, great big, huge rifles, which would give this 13mm shot out and which could penetrate a tank's armour. But these guys are just being presented as pretty helpless riflemen. Why would you stop and shoot? These French tanks, they've got 75mm cannon on them. They're intended to take out strong points and to take out artillery which could be threatening the tank. There's absolutely no reason simply to shoot straight in front of them at this trench. There's nothing really to be gained by it. This is a 23-ton tank, and it's got a 94 horsepower engine in it. That's a smaller engine than your average modern estate car, yeah, and that's pulling this huge, huge weight. And if you stop, you might get stuck. The thing about war in 1918 is that you keep moving all the time, you keep moving or you're killed. So this tank appears to be entering the trench network. If a tank is that far down, it's very unlikely, especially with these ones which were very front heavy because of that big 75mm gun, it's very unlikely to get out again. Okay, now this is plausible. If the tanks were separated from their infantry, then German defenders were able to knock them out. Now what these guys are doing is they haven't got any weapon which can penetrate the armour of the tank. So they're going for what's called a mobility kill. They're blowing off the tracks using a hand grenade, which will stop it, and then they're able to put a hand grenade into one of the firing ports and blow the crew to smithereens inside her. That is how German infantry combated tanks in 1918. It was one of the methods. Okay, stop. Oh. What are they doing? The French have come in, they've got flamethrowers. Flamethrowers were used. They were used from 1915 onwards. The Germans introduced them. The French have their own mobile flamethrowers as well. They didn't carry a huge amount of liquid. That's one thing. And they weren't used in this way either. You might use them to help clear a trench, but the main weapon you'd use would be grenades. But the bigger issue is you wouldn't have them in the first wave like this. What these French guys are doing is they are creating an impenetrable wall of fire through which no French troops can go. Meanwhile, the Germans, who are retreating, are going to get away, they're going to re-entrench, and they're going to shoot everybody down. The chaos and the fear, there's a visceral sense here. I mean, I think that is pretty realistic. But this scene couldn't have happened in October 1918, and that's actually misleading people about the end of the First World War. The fighting that's being portrayed here may well have happened in the summer of 1918, but for October 1918, it's gone. The French and the British, they roll 100 miles in the last 3 months of the war. This is a really, really mobile fighting, but it's just not represented here. So I'd give this at most a 5 out of 10. So here what we see is Manfred von Richthofen, the famous Red Baron, the #1 scoring fighter ace of the First World War. He shot down 80 enemy aeroplanes. And he's leading his Jagdgeschwader 1, so his fighter wing 1. And he was known as the Red Baron because he painted his aircraft red. This is his, I think his final aircraft, a Fokker triplane, the most famous aircraft he flew. They did paint their aircraft in these amazing bright colours. The Germans had these wonderful reds and yellows and patterns. There wasn't any tactical reason for it. It wasn't really about recognising other pilots. Some people say that Richthofen painted his aircraft red to scare the enemy. But really, these German pilots did it because they could. They liked it, so they did it. It does give a sense of the sheer chaos. In 1918, a quarter of the German Air Force, of German fighter pilots, are shot down and killed. That's how lethal this type of combat was. You would see scenes like this in the Second World War, particularly in and around, I guess above, big cities, with unmanned, lighter-than-air balloons, which are called barrage balloons. And their purpose was to force enemy bombers to fly higher, because otherwise they'd clip their wings and get knocked out of the air by the wires connecting these balloons to the ground. You do get barrage balloons in the First World War, but there's not so much use of them. You wouldn't have them strung along the Western Front like this. So what you'd see on the Western Front would be observation balloons. The purpose was to see over no man's land into enemy line. They had baskets underneath them. You'd have an observer with binoculars. And around the tether connecting the balloon to the ground, there would also be a telephone cable. And they were really, really important in making sure that artillery fire was accurate. So it was really, really important to knock them down. The thing is that you'd only have 2 or 3 per sector. Taking down these balloons sounds like it should be pretty easy because they're full of highly flammable hydrogen. But actually it was really difficult and it was really, really dangerous. If you fired a machine gun into one of these balloons, it would pierce the balloon, but the material was pretty tough, and what you would get is simply tiny machine gun bullet holes, which a little bit of gas would seep out of, but not enough to bring the balloon down in any way. And it was very, very dangerous to do because around these balloons on the ground were anti-aircraft weapons. And First World War planes are vulnerable. They don't have self-sealing fuel tanks, so if the fuel tanks get hit, you've got petrol coming out. They're made of canvas and wood. It doesn't take a huge amount to bring them down. With these anti-aircraft batteries directly below the balloons, most pilots would steer clear of them. Very, very dangerous job taking them down. What this pilot is doing is firing a flare at the balloon, a signal flare, which then lights the gas coming out of the machine gun bullet holes. Now, I'm really doubtful that that actually would have worked. It's kind of a nice idea, but flares are for signalling, and I think most likely what would have happened is that if you fired a flare at one of these balloons, it simply would have bounced off. So a bit of a mix there, but I was pleased that at least they show that these balloons aren't easy to take down. I'd give this a 5. This is a great opening. It's really good to see the smoke that they've got in no man's land. This is 1916. The French infantry are going into attack. In order to screen their infantry from machine gun fire, rifle fire, the French would lay smoke so that their troops could come forward without easily being seen and without easily being aimed at. And we've got an officer who is actually leading the men. This guy is desperately trying to maintain control of his troops, to guide them, to show which direction they need to go. It's great to see it, so often missed from First World War films. So the uniforms in this scene are very authentic, and what he's wearing on his head is an Adrian helmet. The French army was the first of the armies to introduce proper head protection for its troops. And that was because head injuries in the first year of the war were a really, really serious strain on manpower. And so having this head protection lowered injuries, lowered fatalities. It's a pretty light helmet. A bullet would penetrate it, but it would protect soldiers. It would protect soldiers from shrapnel. This is an Adrian helmet from the First World War. This is a medical corps helmet. The badges on the front were different depending on what arm the soldier belonged to. You can see this is a medical corps one because it's got a snake and a staff on it. Key thing is the ridge. The ridge, it turns out, was really useful for protecting against the airburst from shells, if you like, concussion. I think it was deliberate. I think they were basing it on a fire brigade helmet, but it turned out really, really well. So this attack is realistically portrayed too. The men are trying to keep spaced out, and that was really, really important. All armies told men, when you go forward, you need to keep space between you, because if you clumped together, then you presented a perfect target for a machine gun. So keeping spaced out was a really key aspect of survival. The other thing that you see these French soldiers doing is using the terrain for cover. They're going in and out of the dips in order to move forward and protect themselves from machine gun fire and the really violent-looking artillery fire that's coming down on them. The one thing that it misses, it's got the French infantry all armed with rifles. And by this point in the war, by mid-1916, the French had already developed a light machine gun. I'd give this an 8 out of 10. You hear them shouting in German, to arms, and then this machine gun opens up. And that seems to me very, very plausible. And then they switch on a searchlight, which was pretty common on the Eastern Front. You'd have searchlights that you could switch on to illuminate the front of your defences. This is representing the so-called Christmas battles of early 1917. And this is a unit called the Latvian Riflemen. They were a nationalist Latvian unit that were raised and that served in the Imperial Russian Army, operating up on the north of the Eastern Front in what today is Latvia. And this was a really marshy area. So it wasn't possible to dig trenches in this area. This is the Eastern Front. This is different from the West. When the Germans took it in 1915, what they did was they built a long wall made of sand and wood, which they fortified. And you can see that really well. The other aspect of this scene that's authentic is that when the Latvian rifles attacked this part of the German line, they had to get through the barbed wire. You had to find a way without blowing the barbed wire up using artillery. They relied on surprise alone. They didn't have any artillery bombardment. And what we're seeing here is what the British Army would have called a Bangalore torpedo, which was like a pipe bomb. It was pushed underneath the wire, and then it had a fuse going back, and then you light it. And that's what these two guys are doing here. They've got these hardened metal plates in front of them to try and protect them from bullets. And it's their job to light the fuse, which will then send off the wire. You see this wave of riflemen coming out, disguised in snow camouflage. They would have been bed sheets or any white material that they could have got hold of. The other thing that's great about this clip is that it reminds us that the winter can actually be a point of really huge activity. If you want to take an area that's a marsh though, actually you can't do that for most of the year. The only point at which you can do it is when the marsh freezes over. And that's what happened in January 1917. And that was when these Latvian troops went forward and attacked this German line. They could suddenly get over the marsh. What you see is the main character, he's dropping to the ground, he's taking cover behind a corpse as the machine gun moves towards him. And then you see a line of soldiers falling one after the other, from right to left. And it's clear that the machine gun is traversing back away from him. And he leaps up and he moves to the left away from the machine gun's fire. And this is what gives him the opportunity to to throw a hand grenade and destroy the gun. And it's a really neat way of showing how an experienced combat troop would be very alert to what was going on, to where the machine gun was firing, and veteran troops did learn ways how to deal with. It's part of the learning process that goes on in the First World War. It's just such a nice human detail that they've managed to get this far right to the wall, in part thanks to the snow because the marsh is frozen, but then they can't easily get up this slope because it's icy. And so they're using their bayonets as ice axes in order to carve some sort of foothold in it. You can see the desperation there. And it's just this tiny little detail that just makes this scene so totally plausible. I think this is fantastic. I give this a 10. So this clip portrays a fictional naval battle between a Russian destroyer and a German armoured cruiser in the Baltic Sea. What's hinted at in the clip, but what maybe doesn't come through as well as it could, is that these two ships are of a massively different size. There's literally nothing this Russian destroyer could have done to hurt this cruiser. Some of them were equipped with torpedoes, and that potentially could have done, but as becomes clear in this film, this particular ship is equipped with mines. So there really isn't any defence that this ship has got against the Friedrich Karl. The cruiser has multiple guns, but the biggest on it, 21 centimetres. If those 21 centimetres hit the Russian destroyer, it's going to sink, or at the very least it's going to have its infrastructure wiped off it. It's going to be a huge amount of damage. Huge German shell hits this gun tower, and it's not even that the gun tag goes down, the gun is still in working order. There's nothing realistic about this at all. You'd be very unlikely to have combat this close either. The German armoured cruiser would have destroyed the Russian ship before it got anywhere near it. It is true that the Friedrich Karl was sunk by a mine. If a German ship hit a mine, you would get an explosion, but down near the waterline. There would be no reason to have this huge explosion that they've produced on the bridge or on the deck. That's doesn't make any sense. There was an explosion, but it sank really, really slowly. It didn't explode in flames. And in the end, the Germans managed to rescue all but 8 people. This idea that there was a fight between a destroyer and the armed cruiser, that's not the case. I'll give it a 2. The battle itself is pure make-believe. There were around 85,000 Indian troops who served on the Western Front during the First World War, and they often get ignored, so it's nice to see that recognised here. The British Indian Army sent over an expeditionary force to the Western Front, so in order to increase their manpower, the British called over parts of the Indian forces under their command. Indian troops served on the Western Front actually right through to 1918, but the bulk of them in the infantry were fighting on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915. And this shows an action by the Lahore Division, which had Sikh troops in it, in 1915. Nice detail here too. This is a Subedar Major. Every battalion of Indian troops had one. He was the highest ranking Indian soldier in an Indian battalion. And these guys were very well respected soldiers. They would have been long service soldiers in their 40s or in their 50s, and you can see him leading the soldiers on just as would have happened. You have this aerial attack which appears to come from behind them, which in itself is odd, by aircraft which are dropping bombs. Now, there were ground attack aircraft, but not this early in 1915. There were aircraft which dropped bombs behind enemy lines on things like rail stations and targets of military significance. But this idea that you had biplanes swooping down at very low level and attacking ground troops, it just didn't happen in 1915, not least because these aircraft are very, very vulnerable. They're very, very vulnerable to machine gun fire, rifle fire. They're not moving that quickly, and they're not armoured. So aeroplanes kept pretty high up in 1915. This just simply wouldn't have happened. The Germans seem to be firing British weaponry. There's a Lewis gun, a British light machine gun that they're firing, and the Germans did use looted Lewis machine guns, but not in 1915. The Lewis machine gun still wasn't on the front at the time this is going on. The mortar, I think, is probably Second World War, post-Second World War. No one really knows. Even they don't know what's happening. Oh, and then the trench as well is rubbish. You know, where's the parapet? And where's the parados as well? This is only going to bother someone like me. I appreciate that, but it's nonetheless, this is not a good trench. It's great to see Indian troops represented, but they could have actually represented what these men went through. This is just fantasy. This is a 1. This clip portrays the morning of the 25th of April 1915, when Australian troops stormed ashore on what later became called Anzac Beach at Gallipoli, fighting the Turks against a small band of defenders. Not quite as small as shown in this film. There are about 90 of them. They've got the landscape right. It was only a small beach these Australians ended up on, and it was surrounded by high hills with steep slopes and cliffs. The Turks only start firing once the Australian soldiers get off the boats. Why would you do that? The Australians are in boats. They've got nowhere to go. They haven't got any cover. If they dive into the water, they're carrying heavy packs. They are going to drown, and they can't do anything to you at all. So if you're a defender and you're facing an armada, you start shooting before anyone gets out of the boat. In reality, the Turks started shooting, of course, when the boats came in rifle range. The other big mistake are these machine guns in the bows of these landing craft. You're going to hit your own people. Clearly you're going to hit your own people. Everyone is going to die, and it's not going to be the Turks who kill them. One thing about this scene as well is that it exaggerates the bloodiness of the landing. There were about 50 casualties on either side. It wasn't as bloody as is being presented here. So, a 3.
I'm Gary Edelman. I'm the chief historian at the American Battlefield Trust and as a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg. I give tours at more than 50 battlefields. Today, we're going to be looking at American Civil War battles in movies. Right away, what stands out is the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was around during the Civil War, but it was not used in 1862. It was also not used in New Mexico, where this is really set. You can count on 2 hands the number of Gatling guns that were actually used in the Civil War, and those used would have been barely at Petersburg and occasionally on Union naval vessels. The idea that these positions are prepared in a battle that in reality happened with nobody expecting it. They've got revetted walls and mortar guns and all this. That stood out right away as something a little crazy. It's pretty realistic in that scene that you see a lot of artillery fire. Not exactly the artillery fire I would expect. They certainly weren't lugging those heavy mortar guns with high arches all the way through the New Mexico desert in order to get to this place. But it's pretty realistic that they're shooting with artillery at first, because they're really outside of the 250-yard, 350-yard range that is the effective range of the shoulder-carried rifled muskets. The idea of both sides charging pell-mell as a melee into one another. There weren't 800 soldiers on each side at the Battle of Glorieta Pass going over a 300-yard sort of meeting in the middle. That sounds more like medieval days than the Civil War. We actually have solid accounts of how Civil War soldiers wired bridges. This was often done by engineer soldiers, soldiers who understood explosives and where to place them so that they could use as little as possible to get the job done there. They seem to be doing a pretty good job in the movie, wiring it along where the piers and the main supports were in order to make this particular bridge collapse. I'm not aware of soldiers on either side blowing up bridges during the Battle of Glorieta Pass to effect some sort of a victory. Battles were often fought over transportation facilities. It was so important to control rivers and roads and railroads that bridges were natural targets of both armies during the Civil War. I would give this clip a 2 out of 10. The fact is that this is so wrong that it's hard to attribute to any one battle in this campaign. This battle of Ellisville, sort of, I would call it more of a skirmish. Here you have a substantial number of people in a rural county sort of rising up to secede from the South to rejoin the Union and capturing a county seat in the meantime. That's what we're seeing in this scene. We do have examples of women joining Union regiments, sometimes dressed as men, sometimes just going into camp to be with their husbands, sometimes actually getting into battle, as female combatants. Fire! Both sides used whatever they could given the time and the materials they had. Sometimes it was simple as using a picket fence. So an overturned wagon, that must have been a great way to stop some particular bullets. And if you had time to deal with sandbags and digging up earthworks, all the better. Cannons are designed to fire particular types of ordnance. It might be solid, it might explode in the air when it hits the ground in front of you, or it might shoot something like grape shot or canister. And maybe lacking all that, that's what they're showing in the movie, is that in this battle or skirmish, they put metal rods into their cannon, and when you blow off a cannon, it'll push out whatever is in there. And at that range that they show in the scene, those metal rods could have been devastating to man and beast. I'm not sure if they could have exactly blown up the enemy ammunition chest that they are apparently showing. I would rate this a 7. I've been to Port Hudson several times, and anybody who both goes there and sees the photographs from this place during and after the siege is impressed with the extensive nature of the Confederate fortifications. It's a very difficult place to try to conquer. I would disagree about the terrain they used for the attack because it's basically in a swamp, just absolutely even nastier terrain than you see there. Soldiers were starting to not only realize that if you could put some dirt just 2 feet thick and maybe a few feet tall, that you're going to preserve life. To that, why not revet that dirt with logs? Why not put a headlog on top so you could shoot under that and have your head protected while you shot? While you're at it, why don't you put pointy logs out as freestanding obstacles out in front of your line? Soldiers absolutely used what we call club muskets, using their musket as a club. First of all, if an enemy's coming at you and you don't have time to take out your bayonet, affix it to the front, and then thrust it at them, you're simply going to club that particular musket. I love that moment where there's a soldier who is actually using his bayonet against one of the other soldiers, and then he turns around and a soldier in the back hands him a preloaded gun. It's all but impossible to load a gun with the bayonet on the end. So that soldier would have already shot his bullet, then put the bayonet on there, and confronted by a new enemy that the guy behind him couldn't shoot at, he simply handed that rifle forward. During the Civil War, sometimes the best shooters were up front and they had loaders behind them. In the Battle of Fredericksburg, soldiers would have guns lined up next to them preloaded that they could just pop off against their enemies. Will Smith's character is an amalgamation of a black soldier named Gordon who self-emancipates and this other soldier named Whip Peter. And it is a true story. I would rate this clip a 6 out of 10. The stakes are high at the Battle of Antietam. For the South, they're coming off of a string of victories. It's possible that if they win again, maybe the European powers will start recognizing the Confederacy. For the North, they're on the losing streak. They really need to turn back Robert E. Lee's powerful Confederate Army while they have the chance and give Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, changing the purpose and direction of the war. Artillerists, to be sure, were cognizant of the horror that tree limbs raining down onto troops could cause among the morale and the health of the troops attacking them. So absolutely, they would sometimes shoot into the trees with that deliberate idea of wounding and demoralizing the enemy. The most seasoned commanders are going to try to get their troops as close to the enemy as possible before returning fire, closing up their line and shrinking their line so that they continue to be shoulder to shoulder amidst the chaos of a battle and wait until you got to the enemy to deliver a killing blow. In an infantry line, everybody has to be a righty, because if you shoot in two ranks, you've got two heads in front of you, and if you're right behind somebody, if you're a righty, you're going to shoot between the two heads in front of you. If you're a lefty, that gun's going to go straight into the head of the person in front of you and butt up against the gun to the person to your right. And the other thing you needed was a trigger finger, and you needed two front teeth in order to tear off the cartridge to pour the powder into your gun. Night fighting in the Civil War is a pretty rare thing. The whole tactical setup of the Civil War is to be able to see things, to be able to see your enemy, for your troops to be able to see your flag. It was hard to issue bugle commands among the din of battle. So line of sight was very important, but they fought at night when they needed to. And some of the Battle of Fort Wagner was indeed fought in the evening. And if I'm an attacking force, I would love to have, as Colonel Shaw says, we will advance under cover of darkness. It's exactly what I would do. In the Battle of Fort Wagner, you have the most notable combat with black soldiers up to that time. The 54th Massachusetts made it into Fort Wagner, but as many Civil War soldiers found out, getting into a place and holding and controlling a place are two very different things. I'm going to rate them a 9. This one brought in a lot of the elements you needed to understand the scene, to show what combat was like in the Civil War. Is it perfect? No. Is it perfect enough? Yes. There is a battle called the Battle of Jenkins Ferry in Arkansas. It was fought in the rain in a field that had begun to flood. And if you're planning to attack that enemy, and maybe you are met with a freak, ridiculously heavy rainstorm, maybe it's to your advantage to attack them that way. Maybe they're not using guns because you can't use a gun when your powder is all wet. I don't think I've heard of an account of somebody actually grabbing the bayonet. These things are pretty sharp, taking it off and immediately using it, but it's pretty cool for the movies. In the Civil War, hand-to-hand combat is quite rare. With the artillery, you're going to fight at a distance. And usually, when an enemy is 10 yards from you, you're going to try to run away. So hand-to-hand combat, it did happen, to be sure. Club muskets, bayonets, sabers, punching and kicking, but it's pretty rare to have it, let alone a straight-up sort of wrestling melee that's going on in the rain. It struck me as a little bit much. I'm going to rate this clip a 4 out of 10. I adore this movie, but the battle scene is pretty ridiculous. If I'm in an open field, I would be tickled pink to have half my body covered by some slats in a fence. I would prefer a big boulder, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to be happy for anything I can use that gives me more chance to live and gives my troops a better chance to repel the enemy. Once you've got the range of your weapon, they could be extraordinarily accurate, but hitting a moving target laterally is probably not easy for anybody except the best shooters. Certainly it's possible. Is it unlikely, that he could make it through such a hailstorm of bullets? Yeah, it seems pretty unlikely to me. They could have hit him while he was resting. He was definitely within easy musket range at that point, but the Civil War produces hundreds of examples of that man is too brave, don't shoot him. So there was a gentlemanliness and an honor.
Is this the last one? I don't know. There's no ether either.
One of the greatest myths of the Civil War is that Civil War surgeons are sort of sawing through people's bones without any sort of painkiller and no preparation while they scream to their surgeries, only biting on a bullet or a stick or something like this. And it's just not true. Most of those amputations were conducted with the use of morphine or ether, a substantial painkiller that would allow surgeons to actually carefully prepare for the actual amputation by cutting away the muscle, leaving a skin flap, and then sawing through the bone with a saw so sharp that it wouldn't take that long. Amputation was the most common surgery employed during the Civil War for good reason. Surgeons of the time could not deal with the complexities of internal injuries on the torso, but you could turn a wound to your extremities into something they could treat by amputating it.
At least there's no gangrene. Where there will be if it doesn't come off soon.
The dreaded infection, gangrene, for which the Civil War would start to produce a cure, actually. Medical advancements were made, very often with great frequency during the Civil War. But surgeons understood the idea of infection, but they didn't have an understanding of microbiology yet. I'll rate this clip a 6 out of 10.
Ready, boys?
Gettysburg has sort of emerged as the greatest battle of the Civil War, and we have a lot of good accounts about what happened on Little Round Top. The Little Round Top set in the movie is extraordinarily accurate. It lacked the larger boulders that are actually on the hill today, and the soldiers really didn't have time to build a stone wall until after the fighting. But other than that, the open woods and the slope were very close to what you could see today.
Send out word to take ammunition from the wounded. Make every round count. Go. Here they come again.
Ammunition is heavy, and both armies have a limited supply of it. If an enemy attacks you 4, 5, 6 times, as the Confederates did on Little Round Top, the Union would be naturally running out of ammunition. There's no big reserve train of ammunition anywhere. They'd already looked in the cartridge boxes of their dead and wounded comrades. They were at the absolute end at that point. And there were no troops on Little Round Top until just a few minutes before the actual fighting took place. No one had time to build the impressive stone walls. No one had time to really scout out the position and figure out who's going to go where. It was one brigade, sort of placing soldiers rather quickly before the Confederates attacked. These huge armies end up meeting upon their flanks at Little Round Top with basically equal numbers. It's something they showed pretty well in the movie in terms of numbers. The Union had already repulsed 5 attacks, and they saw the Southerners forming for one more. They were really out of options, and in a desperate moment, their Colonel Chamberlain, you see him order the bayonet. We don't have bullets, so let's use the pointy spears on the front of our guns and charge down into them.
Left wing, right wheel. Right wheel! Charge!
They did a simple military maneuver that the movie spells out well for us. The Union line, the 20th Maine Regiment, was sort of straight, but then when the Confederates came from this side, they sort of formed into almost a V at some point. As they wanted to fall upon the Confederates, they wanted to do this and then this. So in other words, the left wing of the regiment, this is my left, is going to do a wheel so that they come on line with the rest of them, at which time the whole regiment would wheel down the hill into the enemy, and it worked. I would rate this clip a 9.
Close it up.
You see them sort of lighting the fuse and then putting sandbags up because they didn't want the explosion coming back their way. This actually happened, but one thing I really wish they could have included was that they lit the fuse and waited 5-10 minutes and nothing happened. And then they had to remove the sandbags, and the bravest man in the world had to go into that shaft and find out where it had broken and splice it and light that thing again and run back out, and it worked. The Union had made careful plans for this attack. And part of that plan is, of course, to get the Union soldiers as close to the coming crater as possible so that they're going to cross the least amount of ground as possible before they were on top of the enemy. the ferocity of the blast ripping clothes off of people. So many would have been just absolutely disintegrated, in the initial blast. I think it's something like 300 South Carolinians just gone.
It's a turkey shoot! They run themselves into a hole!
This idea of the turkey shoot, they've got themselves trapped in their own hole, is true, but not like you see it in the movie. First of all, the attack into the crater was part of a much larger attack, with Union soldiers really exploiting some of their gains. Over the course of an hour or so, the Confederates are able to muster soldiers from another part of the battlefield that were able to come and then sort of push the Union soldiers back and shoot down upon those Union soldiers at the same time. So they weren't exactly surrounding the Union soldiers who were hapless inside the crater. Some were in there to be sure, but other soldiers are on both sides of the crater as well. This idea of using a gun as a spear at the right moment, absolutely documented during the Civil War. There's a real health concern about leaving man and beast rotting on the lines you're supposed to occupy. They showed a Confederate soldier grabbing a belt buckle off of a dead Union soldier because this is something that would happen regularly. One thing the Union had was more of almost everything the South needed, and that also went for textiles. So after a battle, either side would have rooted through the enemy dead or wounded. Others saw the need of the moment, like, I need to keep my pants up, and I need a new belt buckle. And I think that's what we're seeing there in that scene. I would give it a 5. Some of it's so overdone. It's such a dramatic scene, but it's very effective outside of its accuracy. The blockade is sort of the unsung hero for the Union of the Civil War. They would blockade all the southern ports, preventing them from getting the things they needed to wage the war. It took a while, but eventually the blockade worked, and the South had real trouble getting things from Europe or from anywhere as the war went on, and they couldn't produce it all themselves. But that blockade wouldn't have been on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. These were on the North Atlantic Ocean and in the Gulf of Mexico, really blocking places like Wilmington, North Carolina, and Mobile, Alabama. But all those places had fallen by then anyway, so the blockade was almost a non-issue. The emergence of ironclad vessels changed the face of warfare forever. The days of the wooden ship were quickly ending after March of 1862, when iron ships started fighting against each other. This is something the clip did pretty well. It showed pretty accurately a Confederate ironclad vessel that would have had thick plates of iron in this fashion on the outside, and they correctly showed the way that it was designed to ricochet projectiles coming toward it. Artillery on a ship is often on a track so that it could handle the substantial recoil necessary from such a large charge of powder. But you would load it, tamp it down, and then move the gun back out through the well. Ironclad vessel had a good number of cannons, sticking out of the ports. So you have a few vulnerabilities on the ship. I mean, if you hit that rudder, suddenly the ship can't steer anymore. Secondly, you have these ports where the guns stick out, which could be opened or closed as necessary. If you get a projectile in there, especially an exploding projectile, you're going to do substantial damage inside the ship. Third, if you can hit the pilot house, you can't see from inside those ships except out of that pilot house. This battle is being fought in Richmond, Virginia, as Richmond is burning. The Confederate Army is fleeing at this point, and it's not till the next day and the day after that the Union really started occupying these areas and capturing the cities. The Union has just cannon after cannon and regiments of men on the shoreline ready to batter this Confederate cannon. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous, at least that close to Richmond, that they would be set up for such an engagement. If anything, the Union controlled the rivers, further downstream. So if anything, the Union would have had naval vessels going against them. I would rate this clip a 4. I guess I would call this clip cool and a lot of fun, but not a whole lot of accurate history there.
My name is Bill Allison. I'm professor of history at Georgia Southern University. I've been a battlefield tour guide in Vietnam, and I've written several books on the Vietnam War, including one on My Lai. All that's pretty accurate. The helicopters themselves are the UH-1 Hueys, as well as the helicopter in the scene, the smaller helicopter, that's a Loach. So Vietnam is quite rightly known as the helicopter war. Helicopters were used throughout the entire conflict. That's actually Filipino pilots. They borrowed those helicopters from the Filipino Army to use for this scene. Now you might wonder why they're attacking this village. It's supposedly a VC stronghold. VC, the Viet Cong. Why do they have to get it over this village into the river? Why can't they just go up the coast? If you've not seen the film, there's a river patrol boat. They need to get on the Nung River. The problem there is the tidal flow is not deep enough for the boat to actually get across the sandbars. And that actually is real. That's a problem. Playing Valkyries just kind of blew your mind, right? Is that real? Probably less so. In at least one case, I know Winston Groom, a veteran who did PSYOPs, he remembered flying around at night playing Vietnamese funeral music to try to freak out the VC. Was it effective? I would think not. And I think part of that is making an assumption about the Vietnamese, that they're not as smart, that they would be fallible to superstition and things like that. Okay, there's napalm at work. Napalm is ubiquitous in the Vietnam War. It's very common. It actually is derived from World War II. Give you a point of comparison, probably about 30,000 tons of napalm was used in Korea. Almost 400,000 tons of napalm was dropped in Vietnam. So it's highly flammable. It's kind of like a gelatinous substance. So if it gets on you and burning, it sticks to you. You know, most people don't survive it. But it's designed to destroy cover, and if enemy are in there, then from your perspective of using it, all the better, which is pretty horrific. It's a horrific weapon.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Napalm does smell. Obviously, with everything that's in it, it's going to have a very gasoline-y, petroleum-like smell, so it has a very distinct odor to it, for sure. Now there's Robert Duvall as Colonel Kilgore, probably one of the most iconic characters in any Vietnam film. He is based on in part by a guy named John Stockton, who was the commander of the unit that's depicted here, the 9th Cav of the 1st Cavalry Division. As far as it being a piece of film, I'd give it a 10, right? In reality, you know, it's a little ludicrous on a lot of levels, so I'm guessing probably about a 5. The PAVN, also known as the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, so it's the People's Army of Vietnam. The PAVN getting ready, I think that's pretty accurate. What this scene is depicting is the January 1st, 1968 attack on Fire Support Base Burt, which is near the Cambodian border. It's part of the 25th Infantry Division's area of operations. Oliver Stone, the director of platoon, was in the 25th Infantry Division and was involved in these engagements. So that weapon they put lodged in the tree there, it's in essence a marker for the VC and PAVN guys to know where they're at. So if they have to go back, they'll see that marker in the tree, they'll have a waypoint. This is an outer defensive perimeter, and they've got tripwires set up for flares to go out, and that tells you somebody's out there. Okay, what Charlie Sheen just did there was fire the claymores. So you've got these claymore mines wired out along the perimeter. So when the enemy comes through, they're explosive and they shoot out a bunch of shrapnel. And so you try to bang it so that it will fire. So the bunkers that you see Charlie Sheen in and others, if you had the time to cut down a couple of trees and put some logs on top of you, that's a good defensive position to be in. You had a command bunker, which the guy runs into with a grenade, blows it up, right? I'm like, good luck with that. One, you got to know where it's at. Two, you got to be able to see it. It's dark, except for the flashing of different explosions and stuff, which means you're going to have trouble maintaining your night vision. So That probably more likely could have been hit by mortars or something like that from the enemy.
Dump everything you've got left on my pod. We are coming
Okay, this is a really desperate act to call everything remaining, everything up in the air. The problem with that is you're going to kill a lot of your own guys. And how often that happened in Vietnam? Very rarely. So a fire support base is actually, it's a small post, but it's very well organized, very well defended. What's depicted here is not that. And so the VC are hitting it before it's well defended. And the actual battle, I'm not sure that's actually, that realistic. If you watch the scene in its totality, I'd have to give it a 6 maybe. As far as the actual real battle, I think it's a little overplayed. Tunnels were kind of the go-to fortification, especially for the Viet Cong. But for the PAVN, that part, I don't know. I could see where they would have entrenched bunkers, probably. But to spend the time to dig an entire complex like was depicted in the scene seems to me a bit of a stretch. VC would do that because the VC usually are locally based, not moving around as much. They have an operating area and they're going around. PAVN, they're moving around. So this is where we're really infatuated with the helicopter as a way to bring lots of troops into an area that otherwise you can't really get to. And the idea is an element of surprise, although a bunch of helicopters coming at you isn't really surprising because you can hear them from a long way off. So this is depicting the November 1965 Battle of the Ya Drang Valley. This is really the first time where American forces face off against the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, like, in hand, tete-a-tete, right? This is part of Americanizing the war. That, the Johnson administration, the Pentagon, MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, determined that the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, is not quite ready to fight on its own. This is a PAVN operation. Those were clearly Viet Cong. They had the hat, the conical hat, the black, right? Okay, so the way the PAVN reacts, it seems like there's just mass wave assault. And that's actually kind of accurate. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 against the French, General Giap, just ordered wave after wave of these costly assaults. I mean, they won the battle, they defeated the French, but at great cost. And Giap was criticized for this. But this kind of stays in the doctrine, if you will, for the PAVN. This is how you do things. And in this scene, part of the tactic is to get as close to the Americans or to your enemy as possible. So if you can get close and hug your enemy as quick as possible, that makes it much more difficult to call in the airstrikes. But they're learning. This is early. We're talking 1965 here. So I don't think the PAVN is fully appreciative of the capability of American air power, how quickly it can respond.
Broken arrow! Broken arrow! 150!
Okay, broken arrow. For a lot of us, if we heard broken arrow, we would say, well, Hal Moore lost a nuclear weapon. What's going on there? Because that's what the code word is for. Some incident with a nuclear weapon. Broken arrow may have been the code word for that particular operation. If they were in danger of being overrun, what happens when you call broken arrow, all air assets in the area, whatever's up there is supposed to converge on your position and drop on the coordinates that you give. And that's what happens here. And that's real. But it's not Hal Moore going broken arrow, broken arrow. According to the book, it was the forward air controller. Minor inaccuracy. But Mel Gibson has to be the hero, right? So there's your napalm. And in one of these attacks, it is true that the napalm was dropped so close to Moore's perimeter that a couple of American soldiers were actually burned in the napalm attack and killed. I know a lot of people who really like this film, and because it's dramatic, and if they've read the book especially, but it fails on a lot of levels, I think. I'd give it a 5.
Look out there, Sergeant. Can you see them? They got rifles. Can you see the rifles?
This is a bad situation. We've totally lost command and control here. He didn't want them to fire, but someone started firing. The lieutenant there, he's clearly lost it because he's seeing things that aren't there. So he's seeing VC running around, and he can see their SKSs or AK-47s. Tom Cruise's character is looking and going, I don't really see that. You've got bad leadership at the top, guy makes a bad assumption. Then you have lack of command and control, discipline over your own troops. This is not outside the realm of possibility.
We didn't do this, did we? Oh my God, Jesus Christ.
This just shows how things can go wrong, and a lot of civilians get hurt and killed. So if this village had been a VC stronghold, and there had been actual Viet Cong in there, clearly identifiable and everything, no doubt they would have fired into the village and then swept into the village. This is not so much like a search and destroy mission, it's more of a sweep and clear. Search and destroy, which is a pretty common tactic for the Americans in the Vietnam War, is basically go out, try to find the enemy, make contact with the enemy, then call in firepower to destroy them, literally kill them. But when you do things like this in the scene and you kill a bunch of innocents, that sets you back a lot with the local population. But there were instances where villages were attacked innocently. So for example, the My Lai massacre, which occurred in March of 1968, when a company of American troops, as part of Task Force Barker, went into the Son Mi village complex, and specifically My Lai itself, expecting to find an entire battalion of Viet Cong. And they get in there and there's no 48th Local Force Battalion. It's not there. The villagers are there, but they're so amped up that there's some immediately assume that they're all VC. By the end of the day, between My Lai and a couple of other places in that area, well over 500 men, women, and children were killed. But My Lai is a rarity. It's an exception. I'd give it an 8. It shows just how a couple of bad decisions or happenstance can cause a tragedy in war. And unfortunately, war is all about tragedies happening. So the setup here is you got John Rambo coming in on this mission to rescue these American POWs who are, probably listed as MIA. The war is over and there's still Americans being held by the nasty Vietnamese, right? There's no evidence at all that there were any Americans still held after the war. None. But after the war, there became a cottage industry in Vietnam and especially in Thailand of selling false information to families who had people listed as missing. And all those missing names are listed in the New York Times. They know who they are. They know the units and everything. They can create fake dog tags and rust them up and everything. And you'll pay, $10,000 to somebody in Bangkok who has this information on your loved one, right? In the hope of. Ross Perot got hung up in this, trying to rescue people. Again, Chuck Norris made 6 films about going back and rescuing these people. We get our history from movies, so we all come to believe that this is the case, right? It's a tragic deal all the way around, I think. When this film comes out, height of the Cold War, you got to have the Russians in there, right? Now, would a Russian been out there at this prison? Probably not. Thousands of Russian and Chinese technical advisors, military advisors, were in North Vietnam throughout the whole conflict. A lot of them were there to train, for example, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft crews to operate these Soviet and Chinese fairly sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, but they also have, operational and strategic advisors. So that's not uncommon at all. I gotta like a guy who's muscled like that and can operate an M660 with impunity and kill pretty much everyone around him. But as far as reality goes, zilch. Got to give it a 0. Okay, let's set up this scene. This is from the Green Berets. It was filmed in 66, 67, released in June of 1968. So this is after the Tet Offensive, after the New Hampshire primary, after Martin Luther King's been assassinated, Johnson's announced he's not going to run again. This is not the best time to release a Go-Ra Vietnam film. This is based on Robin Moore's novel called The Green Berets. In this particular scene, this Green Beret team is going to kidnap this Pavan colonel or general, but as far as units working together, like with the Green Berets, maybe 1965, 66, 67, there's probably more of the Americans working on their own. There would always be an ARVN liaison with bigger units, like probably at the battalion or regimental level, certainly at the division level. The game must have been engrossing because they don't hear anybody else. You've got 6 or 7 guys coming through with combat gear and combat boots on a pier and beam wood floor that apparently doesn't squeak, and they're none the wiser. It's just totally ludicrous. And now we have to do this in dramatic fashion, and we have to rappel off the second story, because apparently the guys playing Mahjong still are not alerted that something's going on. Everything goes according to plan. So the tripwire, is that a common thing for special forces to do? I'd say no, because you want to be able to get out of there and get away quickly if you're on some sort of mission anywhere close to like this one. But even then, do you have time to do it? That's more of a thing you set for a defensive position. Can I have a rating of should never have been filmed in the first place? 0, totally. And I hate to do that, because part of me likes some John Wayne films, but this one, no. This scene is depicting the battle for Hue City, which is part of the Great Tet Offensive in January 1968. What you just saw with the tank going forward, the Marines going behind the tank, yeah, that's good policy. But then you see all the firing, so it's been pre-sighted. But what's funny to me is then the Marines get up and immediately go into that area where they just pre-sighted, pre-ranged fired. So if I was the bad guy, the enemy, I would have fired again while the Marines were all right there. But they don't do that. Now, to be clear, this looks nothing like Hue City at all. Hue City, there's no tall buildings like that. It's very dense buildings. There's not a lot of maneuver room. But here it looks really open. In part, this is because they filmed this outside of London at Beckton Gas Works. The one thing they do get right, because it's outside of London, it's overcast. So during the battle for Hue, it was overcast for most of the time, which made it difficult to get air support in. Now, if you notice at the very beginning there, when the firing starts to come from the building, it's not a single sniper, it's several machine guns set up there. A sniper would have fired a couple of shots and got the heck out of there. These guys are in place, so it's hard for them to move. So that's why the Marines respond with just blasting the area with fire, trying to hit them. All right, so there he is taking a picture. It was not uncommon for soldiers to have nice cameras, because they get R&R sometimes. They can go to Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City, I should say now. If they're officers, they can go to Hong Kong or someplace like that, and you could buy really nice cameras for not very much. And this would have been a Pavan sniper. The Pavan snipers are going to go after specific targets. VC snipers tended to use the tactic just to cause chaos and fear. So you randomly hit somebody. You see a guy on a radio headset talking on the radio, that's probably an officer, you're an easy target. The visual part of it, the setting of it is, to me, all wrong. Other than the overcast skies, that is realistic. I don't know, I'd give it probably a 6. I don't think he needs binoculars to see that the enemy is approaching, but it's a good touch. The scene is really about the 1972 attack on Quang Tri. So the PAVN have occupied Quang Tri City and the Citadel, and the ARVN are trying to take it back. And the ARVN, of course, they've got all the American stuff. So their uniforms were American styled. That's spot on. So you got to remember, this is 1972, following the Easter Offensive. So by that stage, even though the United States is technically still in the war, we're not doing a lot of combat activity at that point. Most of our troops are out of Vietnam by then. Equipment's good. They've got AK-47s, some RPGs there. So the PAVN unit that's depicted here is a basic infantry unit. Yes, by this time in 72, they've got tanks. They're a conventional force. The only thing they don't really have a lot of is air. You did see initially the forward artillery guy calling in the artillery strikes, which didn't do anything. But there's no depiction of him, asking for an adjustment of fire to hit, which I think in reality, there would have been a fire adjustment and they would have kept firing on those APCs until they got really close to the PAVN perimeter there. So that part of it, I think, is not accurate. I like this movie. Its production value is not great, but the storyline and the period it's set in and the way they depict soldiers and everything, I like it. And this battle scene, even though the ARVN guys are out there exposed and whatnot, I got to give it a 6 or 7, actually. I kind of like this one. So this is depicting the 101st Airborne Division's assault on Hill 937 in the Assaw Valley in 1969. Became known as Hamburger Hill. Now the problem with this particular hill is it's pretty steep. And because of its steepness, and that the PAVN guys are well entrenched on the top and dug in, and also along the edges of it, on the slopes, it made it difficult for aircraft to get in and hit it. Now, the strategic value of the hill itself, it's not the physical hill. It is the fact that that PAVN regiment is on it. One of the strategies employed in the war by MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, was body count, attrition. The more we kill of them, the better. Attrition was just one of several strategic approaches we employed. Pacification was one. Actually, this is very akin to a World War I battle with entrenched positions. They've got machine guns set up. They've also, of course, because they're already up there and dug in, they've got mortar sites pre-sighted. So as the airborne guys are coming up the hill, they're getting popped because they're in places that have been pre-sighted. Booby traps are synonymous with Vietnam. The VC, the Viet Cong especially, used them all across South Vietnam in areas where they knew American or ARVN soldiers might be patrolling. One of the most gruesome ones is this: they dig a hole and they put in 2 rotors with punji stakes in it. And as your foot goes down in it, it rolls down and it chews your calf up. Pretty gruesome stuff. The PAVN's got more equipment, so they can do more explosive type things. They can set up more, claymore, tripwire type things, et cetera, because they have more of that equipment available to them. So that's kind of why, in this case, you've got more of the explosive type stuff set up than the punji stakes. The airborne troops did ultimately take the hill after several frontal assaults. Why keep doing it? Why keep at it? In part because the PAVN guys were up there. And I think the blood calculus, the butcher's bill, was we are doing equal, if not more, harm to them. And that was worth the cost, according to the commanders. This is fighting at its grimmest. 72 Americans were killed. After the battle was over, looking around, they found over 600, PAVN bodies. The controversy around this battle was the casualties, plus days later, the Army abandoned the hill after it was taken. And that raised a lot of concern in the United States about, hey, what are we doing? I like Hamburger Hill. It's one of my favorite Vietnam films, and so I'm a little biased here, but I would give this probably 8 or 9 out of 10. I think this is good stuff. Okay, challenge flag. With that helicopter coming in and staying stationary for so long in that valley, in direct fire, right? They would not have done that. There would have been covering, birds, helicopters around, to assist if needed. Because if you stay still, somebody with a rocket-propelled grenade or an RPG, as they call it, is going to schwack that helicopter. And sure enough, that's what happens. They're Viet Cong, they're not uniformed. That's how you can tell. PAVN would always have a uniform. Women serving with the Viet Cong, yes, absolutely. Gender did not matter in this war for the Viet Cong or the PAVN, the North Vietnamese. For them, this is an existential threat. They're fighting for their survival. One thing that's good here is the VC withdraw, because they must realize that air support's going to be called in to support the guys on the ground now. And now you've got 2 sets of wreckage to deal with, so they got to get the heck out of there. The whole premise of the film, of Spike Lee's movie here, is to show the experience of African American soldiers in Vietnam, both as combatants but also as veterans of the war, returning to Vietnam. At least 300,000, if not more, African Americans served in the war. In the early years of the conflict, especially the 65, 66, African Americans were in combat units and also casualties at a rate, a percentage much higher than their percentage of the population in the United States. And this did not go unnoticed. People like Martin Luther King and others began speaking out on this, and by 1968-69, this had actually kind of leveled out. I'd give it about a 5, maybe a 6. This is actually very real. Ambushes are very common. The Viet Cong especially use the ambush, in part because they don't want to be exposed in the open, because if they get caught out in the open, they're going to get hit with the massive American firepower. What they do is try to catch the Americans or the ARVN soldiers out on patrol. The VC would have been concealed. And in this clip, you don't see them. That would not be that unusual. In fact, a lot of the frustration that American soldiers experience in Vietnam when they're on patrols out in the jungle or in the mountains is they get hit, but they cannot see the enemy. You can see that the enemy has them pre-sighted. They've got their mortars, RPGs pre-ranged. That's why the Americans, Forrest Gump's people, have prearranged lines for themselves to fall back to, what they're calling the blue line. And usually that's some sort of physical structure. It could be a ridge, it could be a tree line, it could be a canal, a road, anything like that. All of that is spot on, absolutely. I just wish Forrest would put his helmet back on. How many times someone gets ricocheted off the side of the head with their helmet on, and if you don't have that helmet on, that's all she wrote. In this particular scene, they do need to pull back. They're exposed on this sort of road embankment thing. They don't have a lot of cover.
I got an airstrike inbound right now. They're gonna nade the whole area.
Calling in an airstrike. This is very common. One of the big premises of for the Americans in the Vietnam War was to use the massive firepower that they had at their disposal. You got to remember, this is a military that's equipped and trained to fight the Russians in Western Europe. Fighting in Southeast Asia, they brought some of those same ideas there. They didn't do it all that way, but certainly firepower was incredibly important. The problem is the VC are good at melting away. Once contact is made, they fire a bunch of shots, they melt away because they've learned that the airstrike or the artillery strike is coming.
I gotta find Bubba!
So now he's going back to rescue Bubba, and this is actually based upon an actual Medal of Honor citation. Sam Davis received the Medal of Honor for going back to retrieve actually 3 wounded comrades. So if you rate this on a 10 scale, I would say this one's probably an 8. This is pretty good. What you have here in this scene is American POWs being held by the Viet Cong. The bamboo cages are actually for the VC because that's what they've got to work with. They don't have steel bars laying around. The Americans were mistreated. It wasn't great, but both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong in the South, the NLF, the National Liberation Front, their leadership recognized the propaganda value of American prisoners of war. So you don't want to mistreat them too much. In North Vietnam, the famous Hanoi Hilton, that's where most of the propaganda footage is filmed about them being in church and doing a Christmas tree and doing things like that to show that they're being treated well and whatnot. Even though some of them had been there for like 6 or 7 years by that point. The South Vietnamese, they ran the POW camps, torture, the Vietnamese police, national police, especially in Saigon, General Loan. I mean, they tortured, assassinated. Of course, we had the CIA's Phoenix program. We're doing a lot of bad things here, and a lot of bad things are happening under our watch. For this, these guys are rogue. The leadership would not be happy with this, put it that way. This particular thing is a little outside the realm. This scene depicting the VC making the POWs play Russian roulette. There is no evidence that that occurred at all. And obviously the way they're depicting the Viet Cong there is very brutal, barbaric, incredibly racist. Why? Well, again, we're talking the late 70s, the war is still very raw. We want to still portray it as that they were a dishonorable enemy. So to rate this on reality, pretty low, I think. I mean, it's got to be a 3 or 4. I don't think it's in the realm of possibility. Nighttime attack, very common, especially during the Tet Offensive. The attacks were at night on the 30th, 31st of January, which is the big North Vietnamese orchestrated attack across all of South Vietnam. They hit almost every provincial capital. The problem was, in order to undertake this, VC units and PAVN regiments have to get out in the open. They're exposed, again, to what? American firepower, and they get schwacked mercilessly. The Viet Cong are never the same again after this. So the positions there, that's all very realistic. You would have had prearranged defensive positions, trenches, bunkers with machine guns usually already set up as part of your perimeter defense. So the PAVN attack where they should attack, which is the main gate, that's the best place to get in. But the problem is it's also might be the most heavily defended. It's the gate that the Marines have to use, right? So they can't have it mined or that sort of thing. So that's actually in some ways a weak spot to get in. So it's kind of a weird, dilemma there for the enemy. But that's where they choose to attack here. Very typical of the PAVN and the VC mass wave assaults. Support for the war in the United States had been falling in the fall of 1967. You have the huge anti-war, anti-draft protest in Washington, D.C. That was a big signal to the Johnson administration that support for the war was starting to erode. So he calls Westmoreland, the American commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV as it's called, back over to give a bunch of talks on the TV shows and Congress and whatnot, to show that, no, we're actually making progress. So support for the war actually goes up. Public opinion polls rebound a little bit, right? And then Tet happens. The American people are kind of like, well, wait a minute, you told us we were winning. That doesn't look like winning. This particular scene I like a lot. I think it's pretty realistic. The nighttime fighting, the assault on the gate, the entrenched positions for the defense of the perimeter, et cetera. I'd give this a 7. Guarding bridges, very common. You often had U.S. Arvin forces on either side of a bridge, over a river or a railroad bridge to protect it. unless you wanted that bridge destroyed. I'm not sure you could be much more exposed than being on a railroad bridge. This is based on a real incident. A unit murdered a young woman who they had kidnapped and raped. Unfortunately, in Vietnam, as is the case in pretty much all wars, soldiers do mistreat non-combatants. There are a few units that were notorious for their treatment of non-combatants. And right on cue, here comes your air power, which I'm not sure those explosions would have been that way. Now there you see an American river patrol boat gets in the way and gets hit by, collateral damage there. That would have been pretty common for a river patrol boat. We had what we called riverine forces. So these patrol boats would have been going up and down the major waterways. I don't think it's the best duty to have because you're out there and you're exposed. Now these things are armored plated, they've got some protection, but you're really exposed out there, open to ambush from either side of the river and things like that. So it was pretty dangerous duty. I gotta rate this one probably a 4, because there's just so much of it that's just not right. So we've got a woman Viet Cong fighter using a tunnel. All very good. So for the Viet Cong to have tunnels and dugouts, trapdoors and things, very common. When you go to Cu Chi today, you can actually go down in some of the tunnels, the actual real tunnels. And there's a few places where they have the trapdoors. Now that's pretty crafty. I don't know if they actually had those little holes they could slide a grenade through or not, push through their rifle. Okay, she was just running around dodging gunfire and then she stops and just stands there. It's like, get down. What they're doing is they're hiding the weapons, so that when they do come through, they don't find anything on them and they can just play innocent. Hey, we're just villagers here, right? Wasn't us. And you gotta remember, when this was made in the late 70s in Vietnam, this is really promoting, still trying to, you gotta show some unity between North and South. And of course, the VC were in the South, so you kind of want to resurrect their role in the war as part of the national narrative for the purpose of unification. Just the way the Smell of Burning Grass, that Vietnamese film made more recently, kind of serves a similar purpose. Vietnam is a young country now. I mean, I think 60-something% of the population is under the age of 40. So they don't have a living memory of the war. But you want to keep that memory alive somehow, so how do you do this? Well, you do it through film. I like this film. It's again, when it was made and the message it's trying to get across, its purpose of promoting unification by kind of resurrecting the Viet Cong role in the war. It's not perfect, but I'd give it a good 6.